challenge than you guys have here, because whereas Maori is at least one dialect, if not a bunch of different cultures within that dialect, there are over 65 different native languages that are officially recognized in Canada, and at least as many cultures that sort of go. So it's not just you are First Nations people, you are Cree, you're Ojibwa, you are Blackfoot, whatever, and it's very difficult to sort of bring that all under one umbrella. The screen's frozen. Oh dear. Well, then you missed my funny picture. What I was talking about. Anyways, Canada is also a massive country. I don't know if you were aware, quite large geographically. Anyway, and immigration has been essential to Canada's survival in the 20th and 21st centuries. In the earlier 20th century, it was quite a racist policy of immigration that sought out very specific Eastern European people that were tough enough to survive the tough Canadian climate. And so now in rural Western Canada, you have a lot of Ukrainian, Polish communities cropping up all over the place. But now in the 21st century, it's predominantly immigration that comes from Asians. So now you have all of these Asian communities that are cropping up all over Canada. And Africa as well, actually. So it gives rise to this huge just cultural mosaic, is what Canada has officially recognized as part of their Multiculturalism Act. Is that Canada has this big cultural mosaic, and if you go to the south, the United States, they often refer to what happens in, because America has a lot of culture as well, but what happens when you come to America is that you just get sort of thrown into the cultural melting pot and you come out American, regardless of where you came from initially. Whereas in Canada, everybody sort of celebrates their own thing, and so then there's all this hyphenated Canadianism, which a lot of people like and a lot of people don't like, but it gives rise to this whole idea of an identity crisis. So the biggest thing, like America's such a huge influence, Canada just really has to really struggle to sort of stand up on its own 2 feet and identify what it is that is Canadian. But because we don't know what that is, it becomes difficult to define, other than the fact that, as I said earlier, we're not American. There is this really good slam poet who is quite famous in his own right, but he articulated quite well what being a Canadian was in this short little video that I'm now about to show you. It's not a very exciting video because it's just the spoken words set to music with him and his poetry. But he's really, I saw this guy speak at an English conference I went to a few years ago, and the evening's entertainment was, like on the Friday night, was, there's this poetry reading down in the lobby. I'm like, sounds kind of lame. But even though I was an English teacher at the time, I was just like, it just sounds so hokey and cliche for an English conference. But I went down, I happened to be passing past the hallway, and there was this fairly large, heavy-set guy who's up at the front, and there was, like, you could not hear a thing in the room. Like, there's everyone, like, there's a room full of like 400 people, even the wait staff, like the waiters and waitresses that were sort of running around the room were all just sort of standing in awe and watching this guy perform. And he's just giving this really heartfelt, what I had never heard of before at the time, slam poetry. And I was not a huge fan of poetry or poetry readings. Even I was encapsulated as I was on my way to the bar. I sort of diverted and went in, and yeah, I don't know, he's changed my perspective on what it is to be Canadian. He's changed my perspective on literature, and I think he's awesome. So we're going to listen to one of his just really quick here now. And this went down. All right. That's all right.
Because you hovered above that thing that was like, cannot download this material. Was this information helpful? No. It's distinctly unhelpful.
Anyway, this guy's name is Shane Koizan, by the way. He's, no, I don't want the Olympic version. He's from the Northwest Territories. We're not very many people that talk about that, maybe a little bit later. Don't want that one either. So this is like a sped up version of his, it's actually a 4-minute thing, but given our technical difficulties, I'll just play this one and hope to get an idea.
Define Canada. You might say the home of the Rocket or the Great One, who inspired little number 9s and little number 99s, but who were more than just hockey and fishing lines off the rocky coast of the Maritimes. And some say what defines us is something as simple as please and thank you. And as for your welcome, well, we say that too. But we are more than genteel or civilized. We are an idea in the process of being realized. We are young. We are cultures strung together then woven into a tapestry, and the design is what makes us more than the sum totals of our history. We are an experiment going right for a change, with influences arranged from A to Z. And yes, we say Z instead of Z. We are the colors of Chinatown, the coffee of Little Italy. We dream so big that there are those who would call our ambition an industry. Because we are vineyards of good year after good year. We reinforce what we clear because we believe in generations beyond our own. Knowing now that so many of us have grown past what we used to be, we can stand here today filled with all the hope people have when they say things like, someday. Because we are more than a laundry list of things to do and places to see. More than hills to ski and countryside ponds to skate. We are the abandoned hesitation of all those who can't wait. We are first-rate greasy spoon diners and healthy living cafes. A country that is all the ways you choose to live. A nation that can give you variety because we are choices. We are millions upon millions of voices shouting, keep exploring. We are more. We are the surprise the world has in store for you. It's true. Canada is the what and what's new. So don't let your luggage define your travels. Each life unravels differently. And experiences are what make the colors of our tapestry. We are the true north, strong and free. And what's more is that we didn't just say it. We made it be.
So, yeah, that's him. And much of his other poetry does not explore, what it means to be Canadian, but he explores much more personal topics in quite a, unique way. It's the way he strings his words together. He's quite poetic, but then he's got just, I think, a rawness about him that I think is what I quite like and draws me to him. Anyways, so that I thought encapsulated sort of what it is to be Canadian, or he encapsulates what it is to be Canadian, I think, quite well. So the crisis of identity, I don't want to be come across as being hugely anti-American. It's just that we have to compare ourselves to being, so close to our largest neighbor that it just defines who we are. Up to 75% of Canadians live within the American border. So there's just, and because it is such a huge, I think ideas transfer, we do have the World Wide Web and all the rest of that, and information flows so much more freely now. But when you're attached to something that massive for that length of space, it's just inevitable that it's eventually just going to bleed over. I think that's something you guys have lucky here in New Zealand, that you are an island, and that you don't have that outside influence. I think your culture comes through. I think of it, you can more, easily define Kiwi culture than we can in Canada. Whereas people just associate us with, maple syrup, donuts, hockey, and what else? Possibly Justin Bieber. We're massive, but we're small. If that makes any sense. We're like 9 million square kilometers, more than 9 million square kilometers. It's the second largest country in the world. But much of the land is quite harsh and uninhabitable. Our population density is, we're ranked like number 202 or something in the world as far as population density goes. Even New Zealand is more densely populated than Canada. And because of this harsh climate, weather sort of defines the Canadian experience as much as being attached to America defines the Canadian experience. And so literature from Canada, especially in Canada before the 21st century, it is all about this. There's 4 main themes that I'm going to outline that sort of dominate Canadian literature. But I'm going to start first with a very brief interview from possibly our most famous living author, Margaret Atwood. She also articulates some interesting ideas about Canadian literature. If I can find my cursor. There we go. Hopefully this one works. I'm not going to watch this whole interview. I'm just going to watch the first 5 minutes or so.
In the pantheon of modern literature, few characters have stuck with us as thoroughly as him, Frankenstein's monster. He's alive! He's alive! Stitched together from different parts, he eventually found his voice. He grew something strong and powerful. It's not a bad metaphor for Canadian literature, drawn together from disparate sources, and it too has taken on a life of its own. A big reason why is Margaret Atwood. From Surfacing to A Handmaid's Tale, she was one of our most gifted storytellers. In 1966, Margaret wrote a poem, Speeches for Dr. Frankenstein, and ever the forward thinker, she's just released it as an ebook and as an app. She's also celebrating the 40th anniversary of one of her seminal works, Survival. It's a guide to Canadian literature that asks an important question. What is it that makes a Canadian story Canadian?
I gotta tell you, I love the fact that you bring your purse on set.
It's got my glasses in it, George.
It makes me think you got something else in there that you just can't leave in the back. It's just sort of mysterious. It's kind of cough drops. I was thinking something more nefarious than cough
I'm not
drops.
telling about that.
Okay, fair enough. The reissue of the book is something, but I was curious, when you came out with this book, you were young and started talking about this stuff, and a lot of people were wondering where you got off.
Yeah, well, it's split in two. To the extreme right, we had people saying, how dare you write a book of 350 pages about something that doesn't.
Okay, so the book that she's referencing is not one of her more famous, like, novels. It's a book of sort of criticizing what Canadian literature is. It came out in 1972, I think. And it sort of takes she wasn't ridiculing what Canadian authors were, but she sort of made note that it was all written by white male authors, and it was all about, surviving in Canada, like just physically surviving, like surviving the harsh climate, surviving the harsh winters, surviving the pioneer era, which are a couple of the themes we're going to talk about, just so you know the book that she's referencing.
Exist. And over on the left, we had How Dare You Write a book of 350 pages and not put in more working men's poetry. I looked.
Yeah, even just the fact that you were young, you just didn't think you were qualified to have a conversation. Did you feel like you were ahead of yourself?
No, I didn't. In those days, Canadian literature was not, and it still isn't, taught much in university, so that the people who were teaching it felt that they had a special pumpkin patch that was theirs, and that other people should not really play with those pumpkins. I haven't gone back into the whole body of Canadian literature to have a look. As I said, 1972 was probably the last moment when I could have written a book like that. But a number of the chapters, if you go and look at the end of each chapter and see what I was saying would probably happen next, a number of those things have happened. I said in the nature chapter that we had been in the habit of looking at nature as a monster against which we were powerless, but that was going to turn around. We're going to start seeing nature as a threatened and fragile thing that we are going to have to help. And that has now happened. The female the chapter on women, that was just kind of starting in 1972. That whole thing has changed a lot. I said at that time that we had books about very young female people and very old female people, but there wasn't much in the middle. Well, that middle has now been filled in.
Something that really struck me was this conversation about being lost in Canada, and that this is something that we are as a people in a way, that most people don't really know what Canada is, not just geographically.
This has been a topic for a while, but the rest of the world is now catching up to us. Because if you go to any country in the world, they're having the same debate about their own countries. And what does it mean to be British anymore? What is it to be French? Has that changed? No matter where you go, they are now talking that way, whereas they didn't used to. It was only us.
What do you think triggers that?
I think modernity or post-modernity. I think there's been a lot of people moving around. I think there's been generational turnovers that have shaken old images, who people thought they were. what people thought their country was about. But that's happening everywhere.
You hear an awful lot about that, this idea. Like Don Cherry was on Twitter the other day. He went off about all these things going on in Toronto. Oh, is this the city we even recognize?
I should point out the cultural reference. If you were in Canada, you would know who Don Cherry is. Don Cherry is heralded by many to be one of the greatest Canadians. What he is a sports commentator, specifically an ice hockey commentator, and he's quite famously racist and very loud. He's a bit of a caricature. He's I think a very divisive character in Canadian culture. When I was a kid, because I was huge into hockey, I worshipped Don Cherry. I thought he was the coolest person. Now that I'm older and I understand more of what he says, I find him to be a bit of a poor reflection of what is Canada. But he is one who is, at least in North America, who's quite famous, famously Canadian. He's very proud to be Canadian. I think he just goes about it, and he, in a very sort of backwards kind of way. He reflects the sort of white male from the early 20th century sort of perspective of things, and he's very derogatory towards the French elements of Canada, which is an issue that we're going to talk about a little bit, and also any sort of European or Asian sort of influence. It's not like I say, if you're not, he's got the Anglophone white aspect of Canada sort of covered. So he's quite outspoken, quite right wing as well.
I was like, this is just the city that we have. And this is the country that we have, and maybe we'll never really understand it, and it might be okay.
Well, there's a reason that he doesn't recognize it. It's called OLD. It's what the younger people are doing that he doesn't recognize. But this happens to everybody in every generation. If you go back and look at the Romans, they were writing about the same thing. Young people today.
But you don't write about that so much. You seem to identify as a younger person. Not as a Don Cherry. You're younger than he is, but you identify. Yeah. I think you are. I'm pretty sure you are.
Really?
Yeah. but you don't seem to be caught up in that. You don't seem to be feeling disconnected from modernity.
No, not particularly.
What do you think
why not? I don't know. I think probably because I'm very curious about it. So I dabble in it. I dabble in modernity.
What's your dabbling taught you? What's the residue from that?
Dabbling?
Yeah.
Well, we can talk about various different technologies. We can talk about people's worries. People have a lot of worries today that are different from the worries that they used to have. Young people have a lot of worries, quite rightly so. What are zombies really about? We can talk about that.
Well, but then you have to figure out, are zombies actually the undead, or is it just an infection, some sort of virus? It gets really scary.
Okay, today's zombies.
Yeah.
Today's zombies changed from yesterday's zombies in 1968 with Night of the Living Dead, first version.
Alright, so if you're curious to know about zombies, you can carry on listening to that interview. But that's basically all I wanted to show about that. So she sort of talks about the background a little bit to Canadian literature. How did I end up going back here? Okay, so anyway, back to the themes in Canadian literature. There's four that I've outlined. There's nature, right? So just the idea that Canada is this massive, huge wilderness, and that there is so much of it that exists beyond the Arctic Circle, which is, if you think it's cold today, multiply that by, I don't know, what is the temperature today? Does anyone have any idea? I'd be quite curious to know, actually. Took me about 5 minutes for my hands to warm up, but that's, I have no network connection, so I don't know how cold it is. But I would suggest that it would have been close to zero. Temperatures in Canada sort of go towards -2, actually. Wow. And it's like daylight. That's unusually cold for Christchurch. But in Canada, it's quite common for our winter to have temperatures in -40, -50 in many parts of the country. Not just like parts, like most of the country gets really cold, with the exception of the West Coast. They would have pretty sort of Christchurchy type winters, I think. Aside from that, though, the rest of the country is quite cold. And in the era when Canada was settled in the 16 and 1700s, there would have been no electricity, there would have been no road works, there would have been none of the infrastructure that we have today. So to establish a foothold in such a hostile climate really defined your existence. And so then with nothing else to write about, this is what early Canadian authors wrote about. And it's carried forward right up into the 20th century. And it's only in the last probably 30 or 40 years that Canadian writers have started sort of escaping from this tradition a little bit. And then the next theme is sort of the pioneer experience. So the idea of what the people who did, those people who did come. So it's an extension of it, surviving in the wilderness. It's what those people who initially came to the country had to experience, and what they had to endure and had to set up, and how that defined them as people. And these are the stories you would read, and I remember very vividly reading all kinds of stories that dealt with both of these themes in the earlier part of my education, especially in primary school. All of it, like Lost in the Barrens, one of the books on that pile that I showed you, was a book we studied in elementary school. And Hatchet is one that is, although, like I said earlier, not written by a Canadian author, it explores the Canadian themes of survival in the wilderness, is one that's commonly, I think it's even taught here in New Zealand. It explores sort of surviving nature in the Canadian wilderness, and that one's quite commonly taught at home in Canada as well. So this sort of culture of survival and sort of roughing it in the wilderness sort of is what most people associate, I think, with living in Canada, and that you have to sort of develop a tough skin, and it's like a badge of honor to have survived a Canadian winter and things like this. Our literary heroes are not the same types that you would find in American literature. There was not the stories of cowboys and Indians that would encapsulate the youth of Canada. It would be stories about the Voyageur or the Coureur de Bois, who were early pioneers, and what they did is basically they just blazed a trail upstream across the great rivers of Canada, and traded beaver pelts. That's what Canada grew out of, was the beaver, was the fur trade, the beaver fur trade specifically. And to do that, you had to endure these harsh climates and just really, really tough characters. And so that is what has been identified as being Canadian. This is what the government, especially government-sponsored literature, has been pushing forward all these years. But as I outlined in the beginning with the context of what it is to be Canadian and where sort of Canadian literature came out of, Canada's constantly questioning itself, like who it is and where it comes from, and where it fits in the literary world and in the physical world. So it is a large country, but it is a small country at the same time. And so these themes are some of the ones that are more dominant in more modern Canadian literature. Like from Margaret Atwood explores these themes in her writing, and most of the more current Canadian writers. And so because of the multicultural sort of smorgasbord of Canadians in the 21st century, it is far more diverse than it was at the turn of the 20th century. There are writers coming out of every culture. But there's no one culture that is Canadian. It's impossible to define what being a Canadian is, because it was not a country that's been there for thousands of years. Like inhabited, the First Nations people have been there for thousands of years, but beyond that, everybody else is something else first. Like if you were to ask a Canadian, where are you from? The follow-up questions would very shortly be, well, where are you actually from? Like, are you from England originally? Are you from Scotland? Are you from Germany? So when I'm asked that question, I tell people I'm from Canada, and then they ask about my heritage, and I go, well, my mom's Welsh, and my dad's side of the family comes from Germany, like hundreds and hundreds of years ago, in Scotland. So I don't know how many generations we have to go back to being born and bred in Canada to be able to identify ourselves as being Canadian. And so these are some of the ideas that Canadian authors are sort of struggling with. What does it mean to be Canadian, and where do we fit? And because of the first two themes, the nature and the wilderness, or the sort of pioneer mentality, which I think was a very isolated and lonely existence, You're stuck with the same group of people, and often just, there may not be another group of people for hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers. They sort of built up these walls and sort of kept people out and kept people at a distance, and so people became quite shut off and isolated. And this is, I think, also reflected in the ideas of what it is to be Canada. Our very first and only Nobel laureate was in 2013, Alice Munro, and her stories reflect these sort of isolationist themes of what it's so many more. Like for distance in New Zealand is quite a different thing than distance in Canada. My first teaching job that I had before I came here, I lived in Edmonton, Alberta, which is in Western Canada. I got my first teaching job in a very small town that was built out of Ukrainian settlers. Let me back up the story a second. So in Canada, in Western Canada, there's this huge, massive land space. It's very fertile farmland, but there's nobody living there. It's very flat, very workable. And then to the south, again, you have the United States. And in the late 1800s, the United States was aggressively expanding, or landed in 1700s. And then there was the railroad push to get the railroad to British Columbia, which was the one province that was sort of connected on the very far west coast of Canada. And then you had the sort of Northwest Territory that sort of encapsulated the rest of Canada, which where present-day Alberta and Saskatchewan are. So there's these huge masses of land. You had Canada and the eastern provinces, Ontario and Quebec, and then you had British Columbia in the west. And then nothing, it wasn't fully connected as a country. So although the Northwest Territory was technically part of Canada, so I guess it was, but it was not the same. And there's a whole bunch of different reasons for that I won't get into. So there was a push to get the railroads across, but then the railroad went through, and America was like, oh, that's some pretty nice land you brought up there in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Maybe we'll just come up and sort of annex that and take it for our own. So then the Canadian government's response was to go to Eastern Europe and get people to come to Canada. And then the enticement was that you come to Canada, escape these terrible conditions, escape, Stalinist Russia, and come and settle in Western Canada. We'll give you, all this land, and in return, you have to work the land and establish communities and all the rest of that. So now what you have in Western Canada are all these like Ukrainian, Polish communities that dot the countryside that identify as being Ukrainian or Polish first, and then Canadian second. Now that we're several generations down, most of those are proud to be Canadian, but they're also very proud to be Ukrainian as well. I moved into one of these communities. It's a small town of like 1,000 people, and it was all Ukrainian Canadians, with the exception of myself. And then the next thing that had happened is in the late 1990s, there was a bunch of German-speaking Mexicans from Mennonites from Mexico that were escaping sort of harsh living conditions in Mexico City. So then you had these, German-speaking Mennonites from Mexico opening up taco shops, and then the Ukrainian Canadians, and then me. And this was about 150 kilometers away from Edmonton. And I worked there, but I lived in Edmonton. And so every day, I was back and forth, 150 kilometers each way. And that was no trouble for me. Well, it was trouble, I'm not gonna lie. But it was not a big thing. Like it was not, I didn't think twice about it. It was an hour and a half in the car one way, an hour and a half in the car the next day. I'd get on the highway, drive, cruise control, I'd be there, and I would sometimes not remember how I got there. So distance is relative. Whereas here, I sort of hum and haw about whether I should go down to Dressmart. I live in Bishopdale, and Dressmart's quite far. So distance is, I think, something that Canadians, authors, I think, are also sort of struggling with. It sort of compounds the isolation that we feel.
Mr. Hatton, we might need to pause there just because I think you guys got Twitter so right now. This is super interesting. Like, do you have?
I just have one more quick thing,
Okay.
and then I'm done. Well, two more quick things. I thought I still had like.
Yeah, no, I always get caught out by this. It's because you guys run away early for assembly on Wednesdays. What do you want to do? Do you want to have another? Do you want to come in at the session the next morning session and your last 2 points, or do you want to?
Whenever you guys want.
What do you guys want to do? You need to go to assembly now? Okay, sweet. 5 minutes ago? Okay. Okay. Can we just give Mr. Hartley a round of applause? Because obviously
most of the rest of what I was gonna say is more detailed and outlined in here anyways.